We've spent a fair amount of time in this class talking about forests in North America and especially in the United States. Obviously, it's important to remember that most forests and most people are elsewhere. So while most of us will spend most or all of our careers in North America, it is important to understand the global context of what's out there. Because we're in a global economy and share this planet with many other people, and there are lots of different forests. The data for this talk comes from the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. This is an important agency for coordinating food and natural resource information and assistance across the globe. Obviously, it's a part of the United Nations, but this is probably the best statistics available regarding forests globally. Obviously, the quality of that data will vary. Some countries, it's just difficult to get data on forests in those countries, but FAO does their best to gather and collate good data on global forests. Good place to start. What is FAO's definition of a forest? Well, it's right here. They define it in sort of a few main ways. One, it's an area larger than half a hectare. So basically an area larger than about an acre with trees on it that are taller than 5 meters tall and canopy cover more than 10%. So that's FAO's definition of a forest. Includes both naturally regenerated forests and planted forests, forest plantations. Much like the United States, where about 1/3 of our land area is forested, across the earth, about 1/3 of the land area is forested. And this figure shows the distribution of forests and those different forest types. So almost half of that forest area is tropical forests in this dark green. There's about 1/4 of the forests are boreal. So that's this northern stretch of mainly coniferous forests. And then about 16% temperate and 11% subtropical. There's obviously variation in the characteristics of those forests. One source of variation is species richness, the number of species per unit area. Tropical forests tend to have quite high species richness, lots of different species on a hectare of forest, for instance, whereas as you move towards the poles, there's less species richness. Some of these boreal forests, you might only have 3 or 4 species per unit area, per hectare. At a broad scale, the distribution of forest is determined by climate. This map shows distribution of vegetation types where forests are the greenish shades and other vegetation types are shown in sort of gray or brown. In broad strokes, these patterns are determined by climate, primarily precipitation and temperature. This figure was developed by a mid-20th century American ecologist, plant ecologist named Robert Whitaker. And Whitaker plotted different vegetation types on a 2-dimensional space of average annual temperature and average annual precipitation. So basically we're going from cold, dry to warm, wet up here. And you can see how different ecosystems occur across that gradient. So that sort of shows us how broadly climate determines what type of vegetation occurs in a particular place. And then, of course, that varies across the globe based on those principles of climate that we talked about in an earlier lecture. However, when we get down to smaller scales, so for instance, a state, here's the state of Florida, distribution of trees and other plants is determined largely by soil. So this is a soil map of Florida. Even though Florida doesn't sometimes feel variable, it is quite variable with regard to soils and even small changes in elevation and how those influence soils. So this is, a map of plant communities in Florida. You can see there's wide variation. Now, just as an example, almost all of Florida is within the range for instance, slash pine. But slash pine doesn't occur throughout the state. There are places where other tree species or other types are dominant, dependent largely on soils and things like drainage and so on. So locally, soils are an important determinant of what tree species occur in a particular place. Another important small scale or local determinant of what we see in terms of forest is disturbance. Fire is probably the most common disturbance that matters in this way. This example is showing how disturbance, specifically fire or its absence, can determine whether an area is prairie. So this would be like in Kansas or Oklahoma, where fire keeps trees from establishing across most of the landscape. But in the absence of fire, trees like eastern red cedar can encroach into those prairies and become established if fire is excluded. So much of the Great Plains, that ecosystem type is or was maintained not only by climate and the soils there, but also by frequent fire, set by lightning, but also set by Native Americans. So disturbance can be a really important determinant of forest types at different scales. All right, so climate, soils, and disturbance come together to determine where forests are and what type of forests are there. Interesting fact is that ends up with half of all forests occurring in just 5 countries: Russia, Brazil, Canada, the United States of America, and China. And the rest of the world has the other half, the forests. A couple of things to note here. One is that, the types of forests that occur in these different locations are quite different, where, a lot of the forests in Russia, for instance, are boreal forests. They're certainly exploited, but many of those forests are, while not untouched, probably largely undisturbed by large-scale human disturbance. Maybe similar in Brazil. Much of the forest in Brazil is in the Amazon basin, tropical rainforest. And while deforestation and disturbance are a huge issue in Brazil, much of those forests are still those sort of primary forests, to some extent, undisturbed by humans. Sort of at the opposite end of the scale, most of China has been deforested in the past, in one or more waves of deforestation caused by different cultural and societal events. So while China has 5% of the Earth's forests, I would say most of those forests are planted by the Chinese government and the Chinese people. Canada and the United States probably sort of somewhat in between those extremes in terms of sort of the nature of the forests in those countries. Another note, Africa. There's no African countries that show up in that top 5. While as a continent, Africa has a huge amount of forests, Africa contains a lot of countries, many of them smaller in size, so the amount of forest in a particular African country isn't large enough to show up in the top 5.